Hi, and welcome to this audit looking at franchise compensation in King County, Washington. I'm Megan Coe from the King County Auditor's Office. Before I outline the key takeaways of our audit, I want to define franchise compensation because the county only started collecting this revenue in 2020. And what it refers to here are annual payments that are negotiated between the county and utilities for utilities to use the right-of-way in unincorporated areas. So what is the right-of-way? Well, shown here in green, it is a strip of land used for transportation that is wider than just the road that cars drive along. And actually, it's a place where utilities might place equipment to carry things like electricity or water. In King County, there are more than 100 franchise agreements that are held by 95 different utilities, and more than 90% of these agreements are for water and sewer services. If we look at these services in terms of size on the pie chart here on the right, franchise agreements cover lengths of right-of-way that vary from small or fewer than 10,000 linear feet to those that are more than 10 times larger. For example, electric and gas utilities cover large areas and are in the large bucket shown here, while water and sewer systems can be large, medium, or small. Ultimately, our audit has three takeaways. First, franchise revenue has been significantly lower than projected since revenue collection began in 2021. Second, there is a large backlog of agreements left to negotiate. And third, the county has not done an equity analysis on how this revenue affects residential utility customers. Our first takeaway is about revenue. On this graph, the orange projected line at the top shows revenues that you can find in the county's budget, while the blue actual line at the bottom shows payments either collected by or owed to the county because of agreements that were signed as of June of this year. Starting with the previous biennium at the left, actual revenues were about $5 million or $4.2 million less than projected. For this biennium on the right, the county is on course to collect $7.6 million according to our estimates, which again is another $4.4 million less than projected. Revenue has missed projections due to limited staff capacity. There has been one employee working on franchise agreements since negotiations began in 2020. First, this employee was at the Facilities Management Division, and currently they're located in RES, or Real Estate Services. RES was actively recruiting a second employee this summer. However, even with two full-time employees, we estimate that negotiating franchise compensation with all utilities will take RES 4 years. This is based on the agency's own workload estimates. RES can, however, hire temporary employees to address its backlog, which could cut this time in half. To address these issues, we recommend that FMD consider hiring temporary employees and that RES incorporate staff capacity into revenue estimates. Limited staff capacity also relates to our second takeaway, that there's a backlog of 104 franchise agreements. Put differently, the county has negotiated 7 agreements since negotiations began in 2020. RES estimates that the franchise agreement process can take up to 19 months per agreement. The longest parts of this process are in 2 areas, each lasting several months, and this is where we look to see if there were process efficiencies. We found that current agreements save time. While code requires council to review franchise agreements that are past their expiration date, it does not require council to review compensation terms for existing unexpired agreements. In other words, the 19-month franchise agreement process assumes that a utility has an expired franchise agreement when in fact we found 40 agreements that were still current. For example, say we have two franchise agreements with 25-year terms. Utility A signed its agreement in 1980 and it's expired, while Utility B signed later, meaning that its agreement is still current. With an expired agreement, Utility A goes through the entire five-phase process shown here. But with a current agreement, Utility B can negotiate just compensation terms and add them to its current contract, which Council has already reviewed. This allows the county to start collecting revenue several months earlier. We also found that current system plans save time. Under county code, water and sewer utilities need current system plans to get a franchise. As a result, one part of the franchise agreement process is to verify the status of system plans. Utilities with current plans could take 2 weeks to clear this hurdle, while those with outdated plans may require several months or more. As a result, we recommended that RES prioritize negotiations with utilities whose franchise agreements and system plans are current. Our last takeaway is related to the equity analysis that we found to be missing. This is important because the county aims to spread fee burdens equitably, but doesn't control residential utility rates. The county proposes a franchise compensation amount and then negotiates the amount with the utility. How, if at all, this amount is passed on to customers is determined by the utility. For example, we learned that Seattle City Light increased rates by 8% in Skyway and White Center in unincorporated areas of District 2 and 8. In contrast, Redmond, operating in unincorporated areas of District 3, reported no changes to its water or sewer rates after it began paying franchise compensation. If we add in measures of income and racial diversity, we can see that residents in unincorporated areas of District 3 who saw no rate increase had lower levels of poverty and a larger proportion of white residents as compared to those who faced rate increases in unincorporated areas of Districts 2 and 8. The formula for estimating franchise compensation may contribute to this outcome. So when RES determines how much to propose as payment, it starts with the average value of taxable properties along the right-of-way. We can say this is equitable in the sense that it accounts for different levels of wealth. However, later in the process, RES checks to see if this estimate is reasonable by dividing the estimate by the number of residential customers living in the service area to see if the result is below $5 per resident per month. This essentially changes the formula from equitable to equal since it uses the same $5 target regardless of the resident's ability to pay, and thus affects both the amount of franchise revenue collected and how it is distributed. To see how, let's go back to the previous example. Based on property values, the county estimated similar levels of franchise compensation for both Seattle City Light and the City of Redmond. However, after accounting for population and other credits, the total amounts negotiated between the county and the utilities changed dramatically, with Redmond's franchise compensation nearly zeroing out. To ensure cost burdens are equitable, we recommend that real estate services conduct an equity analysis to find potential disparities in franchise compensation and ways to mitigate those that exist. During this presentation, we discussed how revenue from franchise compensation has been below projections, that a large backlog of work remains, and that an equity analysis is missing. Thank you for watching. Learn more at kingcounty.gov/auditor.